much too high in Europe. And we have to deal with that. And a lot of initiatives are taking place in France, in Spain, in the Netherlands. I think in different countries there are policy initiatives on this issue. And I think it's important to discuss it, to discuss the urgency, to discuss how to do it, how not to do it, if you shift tax pressure to other areas, how to do that in a way that would harm the economy as little as possible, etc., etc. Does this mean that the European Union should take over taxation policy? No, this is about policy coordination. But I do feel, and possibly you won't agree with me, that in Europe we should talk more about coordination of tax policy. For example, tax evasion, etc., etc., base erosion, profit shifting, all of these issues are extremely important and also part of our strategy to strengthen the basis of our economy.
Thank you. Now for the
Thank you, Chair. In terms of representing the Minister of Finances, I'm going to ask you a single question. But first of all, I'm a little bit worried about the inability of the governments in the European Union to actually get the economic growth going and to ask the proper questions. In 1992, there was the Maastricht referendum, and there were policy changes in a number of European countries, and this promised full employment and prosperity. What's the situation 20 years later? All the economic indicators are in the red at the moment. Things are going badly for all age groups. There are real structural problems. And what we now see is deflation, which is what we hear in all of the political comments and in the media. Public finances are in a terrible situation, and we find us in a situation where the European Commission is actually turning its criticism onto France. We now see that the balance of payments is in deficit everywhere except in Germany. We're leading to general impoverishment. Immigration is going up, and we find ourselves suffering from draconian austerity, which is affecting the citizen. On the other hand, the financial indicators are still open for discussion. The profits have gone up, and this is because of the support that's been given by public finances and by the European Central Bank. And this is happening to the negative impact of employment. And the richer are getting richer, which is terrible given the account of the awful impact this is happening on the general population. Do you still think that this macroeconomic neoliberal model of the Troika, which is about privatising everything and ensuring that everything happens at the European level, including the currency and the banks, is dealt with at the European level, do you still think that this is the right model? Do you think this is the proper and the right macroeconomic model for the well-being of all of our citizens? I'm afraid that people are now getting angry, and that if we don't change our course, this is going to have a very negative impact on the political agenda.
A lot of the things you said I wouldn't agree, but it would take more than the remaining a couple of minutes to go into all that. So I'll concentrate on your question, which I think was about privatization and whether we are on the right course, etc. Privatization is not the key element of any program. It's in some programs, it's part of a solution to bring down national debt. The expectations of that part of the programs is not very high, and the results coming from it have not been too impressive. Yet, it has been part of the program because a number of countries have unsustainable debt levels which have to be dealt with, and in the approach how to deal with that, privatization can be a part of it. But the effects of it so far in that respect have not been great. Is the whole approach of the Troika the right one? You have to realize that the approach of the Troika is the approach of the Eurogroup. The Troika is not has not set its own strategy, does not design and decide on its own programs. These programs are discussed and negotiated with the countries concerned and then decided in the Eurogroup by the ministers of all the countries. So there is this idea that the Troika is in itself a sort of independent body which completely uncontrolled and undemocratically takes decisions. If you want to criticize the Troika, you must criticize the Eurogroup because we take the decisions on programs. Are programs a good thing? I think they have proven to be effective in the sense that they've pulled countries away from the brink of bankruptcy, but they've been very hard in the effects. Could we have done it differently? Possibly, but there are no easy solutions when a country is almost on that brink of bankruptcy. And the programs have proven to deal with a number of structural issues in different countries. And in a number of countries, they are also proven to be successful. Not yet in bringing down the unemployment to levels that we find acceptable. Not yet to deal with all the social effects that the crisis has brought upon societies. But in terms of recovery of trust, return of investments, economic growth, and even in a number of countries already the bringing down of unemployment. Am I satisfied with where we are? Absolutely not. And do I feel that we have to step up our efforts on all the elements of the policy mix? Yes, I do, but in a right balance. And once again, the type of the character of the crisis that we had, which has a lot to do with balance sheets problems, debts having been built up by too much easy credit in the period before the crisis. All of those debts, both public and private, will have to be dealt with, and it will take time. So there are no quick fixes, and I think that is also part of the honesty that we need to show to our electorate.
Thank you. This was the first round for political groups. Now we start for question of members. As we seems are late in our schedule, short of time, I would make a change in the structure. I would make groups or 3 questions with 2 minutes for each question. So trying to respect our deadline, that is to finish this exchange of views at 10:30, also because President DIJSSELBLOEM and also the chair has tomorrow. So I give the floor now to Pablo Zalpa Bidegain, then Pervash Perez and Donata Hübner. Yes, please.
Herr Vorsitzender, wir sind hier gewohnt.
Thank you, Chair. We're very used here that we have very strong discipline in these hearings, and that's something we actually haven't done until now. And I think that it's important because there may only be one person from each of the group here, and that means that the members of each of the committees don't actually have any time, any right now to discipline. You have to ensure the discipline starts at the very beginning of the process, Chair.
We have been not disciplined for very seconds. The problem was that now I realize that 17 for 1 hour and a half was a too long list of speakers. That we will now solve this problem, making some changes of securing a longer slot. Now, I apologize on behalf of the whole Econ team, but this is not the problem of the few seconds, but the problem of a too long list. But now, let's not lose further time. I will give the floor now to Pablo Zalpa Bidegain.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. And welcome, Mr. DIJSSELBLOEM, and thank you very much for your explanations. I agree with you that the situation of the European economy is extremely fragile, and it's our responsibility. It's our responsibility to ensure that this fragility turns into something else. But what you also mentioned is the importance of the policy mix. And in my opinion, you said it, in terms of the fiscal policies out there being run by certain countries, that it's important that they have a more expansive approach. I agree with you there. I also think it's very important that we stress the importance of the economic reform. But I would like to know your opinion on this question. If we are failing in terms of the scale of the reforms being put forward by the member states, what is the responsibility of the European Central Bank? Is it the responsibility to solve the problems of Europe or to incite growth? It's important that we take into account that Mario Draghi doesn't seem to have much hope that these measures are the necessary measure are going to be implemented. So I want to know what you would do if you were chair of the ECB. Would you have done more than what's happened up until now? And just to finish, in terms of the future plans, I'd like to know what you hope for the investment plans that has been announced by the incoming President of the Commission. I'd also like to know what you think about the strength of the euro, and if you think that this strength of the euro has any impact on the current fragility of the European economy. Thank you very much for your attention, Mr. Chair.
Very much. Pervenche Berès.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Monsieur...
Thank you very much. You already mentioned Mr. Draghi's speech, President of the European Central Bank. I think there was a very interesting point in this speech. Now, for a long time, we were perhaps somewhat surprised that the ECB was looking at the issue of salaries, but here I think there really is no room for false interpretation here. There's a clear call in terms of unemployment being a major concern, particularly in the Eurozone. To deal with this situation of unemployment, each country has their roadmap. Within the roadmap, there are economic conditions, criteria, growth, the country-specific recommendations. This is a key point for defining the structural ceilings in each country. Now, we can see there's a significant drop in inflation. This wasn't well anticipated. We have unacceptable situations of unemployment. Growth is well under what was forecasted. Now, are we going to be blind to this reality? We are trying to put in place painful structural reforms, but is this simply part of the inflexibility that we have to... it's important we try and deal with this situation with the right understanding.
Pervenche, and now Danuta Hübner.
Thank you, Chair. I have one short comment and two questions. My comment is that related to the fact that when you look at the deflationary risks over the last years, it seems today that they are not only national phenomena, but that increasingly the deflation or risk of deflation become a euro area as a whole a challenge. And that means, of course, that coping effectively with deflationary risks by national governments stays very often outside their capacities and require euro area as a whole, the level of euro area as a whole, macro policies. And my questions in this context are two. One is related to the fact that recently there are some experts who claim that deflation at the level of euro area as a whole can be qualified as exceptional circumstances, which means that temporarily higher deficits would be compatible both with the fiscal compact and with the growth and stability pact. That's your current thinking, which I actually like, on how to understand flexibility, include also this aspect, or are there any pressures coming from member states in this context? And my second question is related to the institutional setting of the euro area in the context of the current challenges. Is coordination of national responses to the country-specific recommendations, which is your challenge, your personal challenge, is it enough? I mean, in the current context, or is there a need of a new institutional framework for this euro level macro policies? And is this potential shift to the permanent position of the euro area president, is it the beginning of establishing a new institutional setting for the embracing also other EU institutions, or are we moving in a complete direction? Sorry for being too long.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try and react to these questions. Mr. Zalba, again, thank you for your question. Yes, there is some criticism possible in the approach of the different member states of their reform agenda. More could have been done. And as a matter of fact, the program countries have done a lot, and particularly other countries should have done more. But, for example, the present government in Italy as well as in France has been quite ambitious on reforms, which only recently were once again reaffirmed by the new government in Paris. So I think there is reason for optimism there. But some of the structural issues really have to be dealt with by the member states. You said that Mr. Draghi does not give hope. I wouldn't agree with that. I think that Mr. Draghi's main issue, which is not new, is that don't expect everything from monetary policy. Get your act together. Do what you can within your fiscal space without blowing up the pact. Do what you can in terms of raising the levels of investment, also public where possible. Coordinate your fiscal stance in Europe, and in all of these fields, I actually agree with his points. And the key issue, once again, is it has to come both from the monetary side as well as the budgetary side, as well as the etc. On the investment plan by Mr. Juncker, I'm sure that the new Commission will very soon come with concrete proposals. But also there, I think we have to also look at European funds, how we use them. So I would expect those to be a part of the plan. Also the possibility of the financial institutions that we have, such as the EIB, etc. So I think we have to put together, making use of instruments and institutions that we have, a ambitious investment plan. The strength of the euro, of course, it has an effect. It has actually been going down over the last week and a half, 2 weeks. But it does have an effect on both short-term and long-term competitiveness, export opportunities, etc. But at the moment, it's the strength is actually weakening, which could be helpful. Madame Beres has asked. She said, "Are we not blind to reality?" I don't think we are. I think we are fully aware that where perhaps half a year ago there was a general optimism about the picking up of the pace of the growth, now we are half a year later on, and we have to realize that a number of the larger countries are showing a major drop back in this economic recovery. And the great concern of all of us is that we get stuck at this kind of standstill in economic terms. And therefore it needs policy initiatives like the investment agenda we talked about, like monetary policy, where, as I said, the June package of the Governing Council has yet to be fully implemented, etc. And yes, we should use the flexibility, but it's not a free ride. I think some countries seem to think that by simply using the word flexibility, their problems are gone, and that cannot be the case. But I see you agree. So Madame Hübner talked about deflationary risk for the euro area as a whole. You're quite right. It has become a problem and a responsibility for the euro area as a whole. I don't actually see deflationary risk, but I do see the risk of a long-term, very low inflation, which has to be broken through. And as I said before, it is a joint responsibility for all of the Eurozone, as well as the politicians, as the bankers. Exceptional circumstances, that's a very interesting question, which will be on our table, of course, in November when we talk about the draft budgets. If inflation is very low in certain countries, can that be considered as an exceptional circumstance under the pact? It's too early for me to judge. It would have to be a strong deviation from the estimates, the earlier estimates by the Commission. I don't know whether the present levels of low inflation could qualify as that, but I think it's first of all up to the Commission to give their opinion on that, and then we will discuss that in the Eurogroup.
Thank you. Jonas Fernandez.
Buenos días. Bienvenido.
Welcome. Thank you for your comments. Unfortunately, I don't think I can be very positive when it comes to the current European semester. I'd like to know your views on a couple of thoughts here. Now, we have a national perspective here of European problems, which makes it quite difficult to see the destabilizing effects of the creditor countries. Now, a country can look at its deficits and current account, but when we have this situation, we have direct effects on the partner countries, and that's hard to evaluate. And I think it's useful to look at that. Now, this comes on to my second observation. This semester lacks a really comprehensive analysis looking at the real structural reforms that are needed in the Eurozone, the proper integration of these policies, the importance of having a European fiscal policy and progress with the single market, not to mention improved intergovernmental cooperation. We need this global perspective together with the work of the European Commission. And also there's the issue of the transfer of powers towards the Commission, of course, with the strict supervision of Parliament. I think this is a problem, and we need to think about how we can recover sovereignty for citizens. Now, from this global perspective, do you think that we can overcome this crisis just with national reforms for the indebted countries? Do you think that the monetary policy, even if it's broadened, will be sufficient to deal with our current problems? Will that really help growth? I don't think so. We need a pan-European fiscal plan, a growth plan, and we need to have more room for manoeuvre for countries. And finally, do you think the presidents of the Eurogroup should be a full-time job? Thank you.
Vielen Dank. Ich möchte Ihnen, Herr Dijsselbloem, ein...
Thank you very much. I'd like to make a compliment to Mr. Dijsselbloem. In the last hour, how you've represented the decisions that have been taken, how you've represented them, really well done. So congratulations for that. First question, how do you see the further development in the banking policy? You know, Mr. Draghi's not really said anything new. He said in monetary policy, we have people who are insolvent, and then we've heard some information about Mr. Juncker, the idea of coordinating the Eurogroup, and that this should lead to structural reform in the member states. But that's all he said. There's nothing new. Now, there's a movement in the USA that is trying to push monetary policy in a new direction. So I'd like to know what your estimation is of that and monetary policy. We've got a second question. We've got 7 countries now who have got exemption regulation, particularly Sweden, for example. It's very close to my concerns in Sweden, and I'd like to know what's going to happen in terms of the future accession to the Eurozone. And third, you've mentioned a little bit about tax coordination. Now, you've been asked as chair of the Eurogroup and as the Dutch finance minister, are you ready to look at the issue of legal tax avoidance and do something about it? The number of companies in Holland or in Ireland that are either not being taxed or being undertaxed, and for example the 10 largest internet companies in the world find themselves they've got licenses, for example, or established in the Netherlands in order to avoid tax. And are you ready to do something positive to combat that?
Thank you. Hugues Bayet.
Oui, merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Dijsselbloem has talked a great deal about public-private investment in Europe, and as my colleague has said, what we don't have is a very precise and clear programme about how that's going to happen. I would have a question to have your opinion on a technical problem about the investment banks. Are you going to defend this in the future? Because it's important to have European standards to analyse the situation in terms of the private investments that are made at a local and a regional and national level. What about the whole issue of savings in Europe? Because saving would allow us to have better investment. For example, in Belgium at the moment, local authorities have 50% of the possibility of investment while only carrying 5% of the national debt. So since 2014, there's been a difficulty and a danger, in fact, that we would prevent local authorities from investing as they would be able to because of the debt issue. Today, we don't really know what the problem is between debt for an investment and a debt which is undertaken to cover a deficit. And there's a difference between those two. I think this ban on debt for investment is inappropriate. I've got lots of examples of that. There's the European structural funds. In spite of the fact that this kind of investment is extremely profitable because it enables us to create jobs and to support investment and growth in the future, people aren't allowed to actually go to the maximum level of debt in order to do that. So don't you think that it's very important, in order to create employment, in order to create growth for the future, that we actually see public debt as a kind of active value that can actually contribute to growth? In terms of growth, don't you think that actually investment for growth should be excluded from the Stability Pact? If we try and interpret what Mr. Draghi said, I understood that we have to respect the Stability Pact, but it's also important that budgetary flexibility is given more room. And Mr. Juncker says exactly the same thing. But how can you put forward a broad plan for public investment if you're not also going to enable them to make the investments from the appropriate places?
Thanks very much. Mr. Fernandez Alvarez spoke about his doubts whether just national reforms will return us to growth, and the answer is no. It should not be just national reforms, just as it shouldn't be just monetary policy. I think, and that is also an answer to Mr. Lange's question on monetary policy, I think we have already taken monetary policy in a number of new directions, stretching its possibilities in a way that has never been done before, not just in Europe, but certainly also in the US and in the UK. So the instrument of monetary policy is already being stretched in all kinds of new directions. But here I will still stand and completely agree with Mario Draghi that it cannot just come from monetary policy. I think that would entail a number of risks that we don't want to have. So it has to be, once again, a mix between national responsibilities, national reforms, coordination of a number of reforms which are valid and important for all of the Eurozone countries, and we're addressing those in the Eurogroup. A sensible fiscal policy which allows for the return of growth, and that also entails using the flexibility within the given limits. And that is what we should work on with the new Commission. And the new Commission has also said that it will push forward for plans to get investments at a higher level, which is at the moment crucial for economic recovery. Your final question is, should there be a permanent president? I think that we should have a discussion, and I'm very open to that, also in the short term, about the governance of the Eurozone. But it should be first about the kind of ambition that we want to put into that, on what fields and how far do we want to transfer powers to Brussels, in what fields and how far. And an element of this discussion at the end of that could be, what does that mean for our institutions? What I don't believe in, that you turn it around and just talk about should there be a permanent president and should he have a big staff, etc., when we haven't discussed really about what should the role of the permanent president be, what does it mean in terms of responsibilities at a national and at a European level. So let's just have that debate, but have it in the right order and talk about the policy contents and responsibilities first before starting to build new institutions. That will be, in my mind, the right order. I've answered Mr. Lange's question about monetary policy in a new direction. I think we are already being quite innovative and have been innovative. Future accession to the Eurozone, I think that will become, and as you know already, a couple of new member states have joined, even in a period in which we talked about the Euro crisis. And those countries have proven and are very determined and convinced of the importance of being part of the Eurozone as part of their stability. Political stability, financial and economic stability, and they feel, and I strongly support the Baltic states, those are the ones I'm referring to, in their conviction that for their future stability economically and politically, being part of the Eurozone is important. And I expect the Eurozone to grow over the next years. But that's just an estimate. But I would certainly welcome that. Legal tax avoidance, one of my favorite subjects. I'm always happy to tell you that the Dutch government has taken a number of measures on the elements that you've mentioned. For example, one of the reasons why so many international companies come to my country has to do with the large amount of tax treaties that we have. And we are now going through these tax treaties and changing those to make sure that tax avoidance is being taken out of those. The possibility of tax avoidance is being dealt with in those treaties. So we are changing a large number of those treaties to fight tax avoidance. So that we realize that that is a real issue and we are prepared to work on that. Finally, Mr. Bayet, I hope that's the right pronunciation, you talked about local governments should have the opportunity to invest. I think they do. It has a lot to do with finance and the way that the investments necessary at a local level are financed. And I think there is an issue there. On the other hand, I think it's also realistically a part of our pact that debt levels at a local and a regional level are also taken into account when we assess the debt levels of a country. If you would put them aside, that would be in a long term a major risk for financial stability.
Thank you. Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to also welcome President DIJSSELBLOEM to our committee, which is a new committee for me, but we've worked closely in the last number of years. He is a very effective President of the Eurogroup, and I wish him well for as long as he has that role and well into the future, I hope. Can I say to the President, he rightly said at the end of his contribution, the extraordinary sacrifices that have been made in many countries, my own, Portugal, Cyprus, Greece. And now that countries like Ireland and Portugal have got back to the international money markets, it's important that they stay with the international money markets. One of the proposals that has recently come forward is a suggestion that in relation to the IMF portion of the Troika funds, that Ireland, or indeed other countries, this has happened in Latvia and Hungary in the past, would be able to pay back early the outstanding debt to the IMF. But of course there is conditionality in this because it requires the agreement of the Eurozone. While I know that this issue has not been formally discussed, could I ask you your general position on this view? Would it not make sense that countries who have been in programmes who want to pay back money early and avail of a lower interest rate should be entitled to do this? And could he also set out how might the Eurogroup deal with this request when it's formally made? Thank you.
Thank you. Paul Tang.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome to the President of the Eurogroup. First time since the elections, you said. The elections in Holland were exactly about, of course, the fiscal rules. Our party, where you are a member from and I'm a member from, proposed not only to have a rule, a norm for the deficit, but also a norm for unemployment. Because we're looking for ways in which we have a credible fiscal policy, but at the same time a flexible. And that's the same approach you are taking in this dialogue. And I want to come back to an earlier exchange you had with Udo Bullman, where you say you see ways to combine flexibility and credibility. You say structural reforms, maybe public investment, can be given more time for targeting the fiscal deficit. And you seem, I would like to invite you to be more specific on this. Do you want to have a formal procedure? Do you want to take the initiative to enshrine flexibility in the pact and to combine flexibility and credibility at the same time?
Thank you. Our last question, colleague Muresan.
Thank you, Chair, and Mr. President, welcome to this committee also from our side, the new members. It's the first time that we have the chance to exchange views with you, and we're grateful for that. You stated that the answer to the current economic situation cannot come from the ECB. It needs to be a broader economic policy mix. I certainly agree with you on that. I think you're also right when you say that the ECB and the ECB alone decides if, when and where it will do more. That's why my questions to you are linked to the consequences upon the real economy of eventual ECB interventions. And my question is, do you think the ECB doing more, eventually in the direction of quantitative easing, will lead to more lending by banks to the real economy and specifically to SMEs, more investment by the private sector and more spending by the people? Do you see structural reforms as a precondition for the ECB's intervention to work? And do you see the ECB's intervention as something which reduces the incentives for structural reforms? And my last question is, were the ECB to decide to intervene, do you see a risk of an asset price bubble? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. First of all, Mr. Hayes, very good to see you again, now in a completely different role, and I wish you the best of luck in that important position. Your question was quite specific about the issue of the IMF loans, specifically Ireland, I think it's been made public, is considering an early repayment of those loans, which would give quite a large benefit in terms of interest payments. The Irish minister has approached me and other institutions involved, and that he is considering this. And I think we will discuss it in our September meeting. So in quite a short, this is actually next week, we will be able to go into that on the basis of a request of Ireland, which formally they still have to put forward. That's why I'm a little careful in how I put it. Formally, they will have to request for such a possibility, and both in the Eurogroup and in the ECOFIN, it will have to be discussed and approved, because they will only and specifically start early repayments on the IMF part of the loans and not on the EFSM and the EFSF part of the loan. So you know all this. The thing you're possibly most interested in, we will talk about it in our Eurogroup meeting next week in Italy. Mr. Tang, whom I know very well, we were colleagues in the Dutch Parliament in the past, asked me to be more specific on flexibility in relation to reforms, and I will do so. In the procedures of the pact, of course, we distinguish the corrective arm and the preventive arm, and I think we have to be quite precise on what flexibility in those two arms could mean. In the corrective arm, there is the possibility, in case of exceptional circumstances, etc., to allow countries more time to reach their targets. It will be my plea that we make sure that if extra time is given on the basis of those conditions, that the time is not wasted but used well, and that that the Commission would, with the country concerned, set out a number of reforms which have to be quite upfront, be put on the agenda. Let's not waste extra time if extra time is given. On the other side, the preventive arm, of course, we have the difficult or more complex indicator of the structural deficit and the MTO. And I think that, but that could be also part of the discussions that we will have on the evaluation of the six-pack and the two-pack. We have to consider the fact that the MTO is of course, a mid-term objective, and mid-term also brings in the element of time. Now, we all know that some of the reforms will take time to tick in, and also for the positive effects of reform to tick into the budget will take time. And I think we should find a way to take into consideration that time element of reforms. And when we calculate the midterm objective for a country, we should also allow, on the basis of what structural reforms are needed in that country, design the MTO. Reforms take time, and when we design the MTO, I think we should take that into consideration. But I'm making the clear distinguishment between the corrective arm and the preventive arm. And hopefully more and more countries will go to the preventive side of the pact, so this debate about the MTO and the relations with reform will become more and more important, and I think we should look at that. That's what I'd like to say at this point. Finally, Mr. Muresan, I hope that is the right pronunciation, said he was glad that I said the answer does not come from the ECB. My point was the answer does not only come from the ECB, but I do believe that the ECB has a strong role to play, and I believe that they are playing a strong role. You asked about the consequences of more QE. First of all, the instruments that were decided in June are yet to be rolled out, and its effects through the financing channels have yet to take place. We still have to see what the effects of the TLTRO program, which is quite sizable, what the effects of that will be. And I think that's an important step. There is a risk, as you rightly said, if you put too much cheap money out there, that you will create new bubbles in the economy with risks which will damage our economies in the long term. So therefore, we need to be very sensible about what we do and always have to realize, especially if we depend too much on monetary policy, that risks can come from that. That's all.
Thank you very much, Jeroen. Thank you to all of you. I think it has been a very interesting discussion, and we made some progress also in better understanding how this debate on flexibility, how to move it on forward. Our next meeting will take place 22nd and 23rd of September. So see you to our next meeting. This meeting is closed.